I invite you to turn in your Bible to Matthew chapter 13. We're beginning in verse 24. And I'll be watching the clock to be kind to you, but I'm hoping what we'll do is get all the way to the end of chapter 14. That's, again, over 70 verses that we'll need to cover to stay on top of where we need to be to get ready for this Bible bowl. I have it divided into sections, so try to listen intently as we go through this and absorb as much as we can as we do this and get our children then ready for that test coming up. All right? So let's turn to Matthew chapter 13. I want you to remember, Matthew chapter 13 is a chapter that is filled with parables. And we already had the first one. We discussed that last Sunday night, the parable of the sower. And that introduces this whole set of parables. So try to keep that in mind as we go into the next parables that we have here. Now we've got some memory work. Two verses. Matthew 14:14. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude, and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. And then Matthew 14:35. And when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all that country round about, and brought unto him all that were diseased. So that'll be our two memory verses. Now let's go into the chapter itself. And we start off with the parable of the tares. As I get into this, I want to remind you, Jesus lived in a society that today we would call an agrarian society. They didn't have big manufacturing firms and they didn't have Walmarts and things like this. People made what they had. And people either worked by way of their agriculture, or they would have little home shops, like carpenter shops and all, like Jesus grew up in. And he knew about those things. And the people he was speaking to knew about that lifestyle. And the parables he told are things that they would be familiar with. Now remember what a parable is. The little Sunday school definition that we often give our children, easy to remember. It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And that fits pretty good for most of the parables. Think about things being parallel, where you lay the earthly story down, and then you're going to have the spiritual meaning that's beside that. Now, one thing about these parables, Jesus did not explain many of them. He expected us to think. And he told the people, now, if you want to learn the parables, you become like a child. You be humble and receive the simple story. I've heard some very wise preachers that have highly educated, and they have gone into some of these parables in such depth that I think, could that possibly be what Jesus was teaching those people? They weren't thinking like that when he told the parables. So when you hear the parable, think, what is your first impression here? And that more than likely is right where Jesus was going with this. And every detail of every parable doesn't have to be explained. Some of it is just part of his storytelling. And we got to zero in on the real spiritual lesson that he is giving. Sometime when you're having trouble understanding what the Bible says, especially when it comes to the parables, well, my rule of hermeneutics is, ask a child. Read the parable to the child, and what do you think that means? And they probably have it, and they'll get you back on track then on what that parable means. And so keep that in mind. Keep all those things in mind as we listen to these parables. Now this first one he's going to explain, but not right away. So remember the story, and then we'll get to the explanation a little further down in the chapter. Here it is. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, His enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servant of that household came and said unto him, Sir, didst thou not sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. What do you think that means? Just think about that. You go to hear this great preacher and he tells something like this. What is he talking about? Well, I think you're going to be able to see it before the chapter's over. I'll tell you this, though. They knew about wheat and tares, and I did a little study on this to see if I could figure that out, why they would do this. I know some of you that have raised gardens, when you get weeds in the garden, if you're not careful, you go out to weed the garden, and you'll weed up the very things that you were hoping to get production from. So you got to be careful when you're doing this weeding. And these tares, they'd grow up like the wheat right at first, but they would outgrow the wheat. And the tares would head up above the wheat. And so it'd be very easy for the reapers to go out there and gather the tares off the top and then come back and harvest the wheat out. So kind of remember that as we go into this. And Jesus is going to explain this parable in a little bit. But first, he's got some other parables. The parable of the mustard seed. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like unto a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among the herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. Okay, what's he talking about? Now, many of you have probably sown mustard seeds. I've got some rutabagas in my garden right now. I am amazed. That little tiny seed, a grain, is really the word for it. You're not even sure why you planted them. They're so small. And now I'm getting rutabagas away about a pound. And it wasn't long before they were just a tiny little seed. And I'm getting this big old rutabaga with all these grains on it. And mustard is like that. It's in that same family. And some of you have mustard greens, and you'll see them in these gardens sometime after they'll grow up and they'll flower, and they get all these little seeds. And I threw some mustard seeds in my backyard in North Carolina one time. I threw some out there, and they grew, and they bolted, and they came up, and they flowered, and it did look like a little tree. It grew up and it all branched out like a little tree. And sure enough, birds came and lit in those branches and would eat the seeds off that mustard plant. Kingdom of heaven's like that. What do you think that means? Well, look, you might think it's starting mighty small. But God's got plans for his church, and it is going to grow and grow and grow. That's what that's talking about. All right, let's look at another parable. The parable of the leaven. This is similar to the one of the mustard seed. And Sarah, you probably know about this one, okay? We could talk. Sarah makes all that pizza dough. You put leaven in it, do you? Okay, watch what happens here. Another parable spake he unto them, the kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which Sarah took. Now, it just says a woman took. But this is what Sarah does. Which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. Now, when you make bread, if you want the bread to rise, you put leaven in it. And the leaven is hidden in the dough and mixed up. But you leave it out there, and you put it where it'll stay warm, and it won't be long. You're going to see that dough rise and rise and rise. Even though the leaven is not seen, it works through the whole lump, doesn't it? Kingdom of heaven's like that. Now this reminds me of what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount. Ye are the salt of the earth. I mean, we're out here in this world. But I'll tell you, we have an influence in this world, and it's not always readily seen, but we do our work, don't we, where it's hidden. We don't go blow trumpets and give to do things to be seen of men, but we do our work. And it affects the world in which we live in. We have a better community when Christians are there. We have a better nation when Christians are scattered throughout this nation, like the salt of the earth and like this leaven in this lump. And we work our work in secret. But the results are clearly seen. All right, let's go on. Parables and prophecy. All these things spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables. Without a parable spake he not unto them, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. You know, many scribes and righteous men desired to look into these things and could not see them. But we see them, don't we? Blessed are your eyes, for they see. He told them about the parable of the sower. And so he's teaching us things about the kingdom of God by way of these stories that he is telling. And you see, it fulfills prophecy. Always remember, Matthew is telling us these things. So we will believe that Jesus is the Christ. And one of those evidences is the way he fulfilled prophecy. Now let's hear about the parable of the tares. Jesus is going to explain this one. See if this is what you came up with when you were thinking about that. I bet you did. Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said unto them, He that soweth good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of the world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Did you hear the parable? I tell you, we sow with the Son of Man. That's Jesus spreading the gospel into all the world. And we are working with him when we're spreading the gospel into all the world. And those that receive that good seed are the children of the kingdom. But there's a lot out there that receive bad seed, and the tares are out there. Now, sometimes it's not hard to tell. You can know. Look, this man is obviously not a Christian, and these people clearly are. Sometimes you can tell that, but you can't always tell that. You see, that good seed's a lot like that bad seed. And it produces a plant that's a lot like the good plant. The tares are a lot like the wheat, and sometimes you can't sort it all out. I take great comfort in that passage where Paul writes to Timothy and says, the foundation of God standeth sure. The Lord knoweth them that are his. And I don't have to go through and figure out everybody and know, well, now, are they faithful Christian or are they an unfaithful Christian? Now, sometimes you can tell, but sometimes you can't really tell that. And it's bad. Sometimes people put preachers on the spot, you know, like at funerals and things. And so, well, you got to tell us whether they went to heaven or hell. And preachers can't do that. But I'll tell you what, we can preach the truth and it will bring forth fruit. And God knows who they are. And at the end of the world, there's not going to be any mistaking. Those tares are going to be burned in a furnace of fire. And he's going to gather the wheat into his barn. And that tells me I want to be wheat. You don't want to be a tare, okay? If you don't learn anything else from this sermon, don't be a tare. Take the good seed that comes from the Son of Man and be wheat. That's what you want to be. Okay, let's go on. The parable of the treasure in the field and the pearl of great price. Two very similar parables. The difference is this fellow that found the treasure in the field, he didn't know it was there. He just came out there and there was a treasure in the field. And he saw what this treasure, he sold all he had so he could buy that field and have that treasure. But the other is about a merchant man, and he knew what he was looking for. He was looking for a pearl of great price, and when he found it, he did the same thing. He sold all he had so that he could have that pearl of great price. Whether they stumbled across it or whether they were seeking it, they realized the value of what they found, and it was worth more to them than everything they had. So listen to these parables. Again, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy goeth thereof, and selleth all that he have, and buyeth the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a merchant man, seeking goodly pearls, who when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all he had, and bought it. And that's what the gospel means to us. This is the treasure in the field. This is the one pearl of great price. Now, what doth it profit though a man gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Whatever we have to give up in order to enjoy the blessings of benefit of that treasure and of that one pearl, it's worth it. And we need to be like those men and recognize the value when we see it. Be willing to give up all that we need to give up, that we might obtain unto it. The parables of the net. Listen to this one. Again, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a net that was cast into the sea and gathered of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. So shall it be at the end of the world. The angel shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Well, it sounds a lot like the parable of the tares, doesn't it? I mean, the gospel net goes into all the world, and we catch all we can. But the Lord knows who His true disciples are. When He brings that net inshore and they look over those fish, some of those are bad fish. They're not worth having, and they're going to be cast out. But the good fish, see, He puts into the vessels. And that tells me you want to be a good fish. See, you don't want to be a bad fish. You want to be one of the good fish, don't you? And so it's very similar there to the parable of the tares of the field, isn't it? All right, the parable of the householder. And I love this one. I visited people like this, people that have a lot of nice things and treasures, and you get to talking to them, and they pull out this and they pull out that. Lori and I in Indiana, we went to a fella that I knew he was up there, and I knew he had collected a lot of restoration memorabilia. And we went to his house, and he was able to show us letters that Alexander Campbell had written with his signature on them, and checks Alexander Campbell had written. And he had a sermon book of Cled Wallace, his old sermon book he made when he was he had all these treasures, and he would open up and show us one after another, and we could tell he was enjoying himself. And I tell you, I do too. When I'm up here preaching, I'm enjoying myself. There's so many wonderful things in this book, and I want to show you things I've learned long ago and teach that. And some things I studied last week, I had never known. And I'm so excited to tell you something I learned new. Now here it is. Here's the parable. Watch this. Jesus said unto them, have you understood all these things? They said unto him, yea, Lord. Then he said unto them, therefore every scribe which is instructed into the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old. And it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed thence. You read your Bible, and you're going to come across things you've heard all your life, and they are so wonderful. But the more you study it, the more you're going to see things you'd never seen before. Treasures new and old. You see the parable? All right. Jesus was rejected in his own country. That's my spelling, okay? That's not the normal way of spelling. That's the way I spell rejected. Sorry about that. But Jesus was rejected in his own country. Now watch this. And when he was coming to his own country, he taught in their synagogues, inasmuch as they were astonished, and said, whence hath this man this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brethren James and Joses and Simon and Judas and his sisters? Are they not with us? Whence hath this man all these things? And they were offended in him. But Jesus said unto them, a prophet is not without honor, save in his own country. That means a prophet has honor where he goes, except when he's in his own country. He doesn't have any honor. And in his own house. And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. You know, I've seen that. People get big and famous, and everybody thinks they're wonderful, and somebody says, oh, well, I know him. I grew up with him. You know, we used to go fishing together. We did. As though that doesn't amount to anything, because I know him. And, you know, sometimes it shows that maybe you're the one that doesn't amount to a whole lot and don't recognize greatness when it is right there. But think about Jesus going back to his hometown. I think, wait a minute. We know this man. He can't be that great. Even the people in Jerusalem and all, they said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And it sounds like Nazareth had that same idea about themselves. And so since they didn't believe, he didn't do many mighty works. Now, he did do some, didn't he? But he didn't do many. They should have believed. Now, let's go to the next chapter. The death of John the Baptist. Matthew 14, 1 through 12. The parables are over, and let's get into this. And here's where I really lose all respect that I may have even tried to have for King Herod. He is such a sorry man. Look what he does. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the fame of Jesus, had said to the servants, this is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show themselves in him. You see, John didn't do miracles, and Herod had John put to death. And that's bothering his conscience, isn't it? Now he hears about Jesus. Now he's teaching what John taught. He said, wow, that's John the Baptist risen from the dead. And now he's doing miracles because he's been dead. Now he comes back alive. And Herod had all this all mixed up. But it tells about how John was put to death. It says here, for Herod had laid hold on John and bound him and put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother's, Philip's wife. Let me tell you what Herod did. Herod saw his brother's wife and decided he wanted her. And he stole his sister-in-law away from his brother and married her himself. You know what John said about that? John said, it's not lawful for thee to have her. Now, John didn't say, Herod, if you say, I'm sorry, you can keep her. That's not what John said. It was wrong for him to take her to start with. And so it was wrong for him to keep her. And the one that really got upset about this was Herodias. And so for her sake, Herod put John in prison. I tell you, I was telling my class, and I was warning the boys in there, and I was talking to the girls too. Listen, you'll do things for the sake of your wife, and you better be careful. You marry a good woman, or you'll wind up doing things for her sake that you should never have done. And that's what Herod did. See, if you're a good wife, then you'll have your husband do things for your sake that you should be doing. But not this time. I mean, he married wrong, and now to please his wife, he did something he didn't even want to do, and he did wrong. She led her husband into further sin. And look what happens. John said unto him, it's not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. His birthday, here's a big old king, and he's going to have himself a birthday party. That just sounds kind of trivial to me. But he throws himself a birthday party and has his wife's daughter, which is not his daughter, but his wife's daughter, dance for them. You think anything's wrong with dancing? I tell you, I've seen football players on TV score touchdowns and then do their little dance in the end zone. Well, now that's one kind of dancing. But there's another kind too, isn't there? There's a kind of dancing that will drive men crazy, and they will do stupid things because they will have bad thoughts. You want to know what kind of dancing that is? Okay, go to the prom, and you will see that kind of dancing. I saw the write-up in the paper about the prom, where they were out there and they turned the lights off and flashed, and they were all gyrating around to the tune of I'm sexy and I know it. Well, listen, that's not the kind of dancing that you should do. You don't need to be there. And here is an example of that. Herodias' daughter is dancing, and it pleased Herod, and he did another stupid thing. Here's what he said. He promised with an oath to give her whatever she would ask. See, women can drive men absolutely crazy. Now, men should not do that. It doesn't excuse the men, but women, you can do that, and you shouldn't. And Herod should never have let himself got caught up in this. I don't excuse Herod at all, but a lot of men have made fools of themselves because of what women were doing when they lose control of themselves. And here he goes. She, being instructed of her mother, said, give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. Can you imagine of all the horrible things? She could have had anything she wanted. And she wanted the head of John the Baptist. I bet that wasn't a pretty sight when they brought that to her. And so just like you'd bring the meat out to the table in a chart, they brought to her the head of John the Baptist. And the king really didn't want to do it. Said the king was sorry. Nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given to her. There's another thing that men will do sometime because they're so proud. They'll say boastful things in front of their friends, and then they won't back off when they should because all their friends around them saw them, and they're still trying to impress their friends, and they will do foolish things. Herod was so foolish in all of this. It's just embarrassing, isn't it? Well, he did that, and they gave it to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother. But his disciples came and took up the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. What a horrible way for John the Baptist to die. And none greater than he, except those in the kingdom. But what a reward John must have had. Now, let's go on, and I'm going to run out of time if I don't keep going. Jesus fed the 5,000. Listen, this Herod was so nuts. Jesus knew, I better distance myself from him. He is really being foolish. And so Jesus heard of it. He departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. Now see, desert doesn't mean there's not water. Some people think, well, there's a desert, there's no water there. And they talk about the Ethiopian. Said, see, here's water. What doth hinder me to be baptized? He was in a desert place, and they say he must have had the water in the canteen. Well, that couldn't have been it, because they said they both went down into the water, and they didn't both go down in a canteen. Desert doesn't mean no water, because here in this desert, they brought a ship out there. So there's enough water for a ship in this desert. Well, what does it mean? It means a deserted place. It doesn't mean no water. It means no people. Jesus is trying to get away from the people, but it didn't work. Look what happens. They went into a ship, into a desert place apart. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of their cities. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals." These fellows were so interested in seeing Jesus, they didn't even bring food to eat. And now it was evening, and they were going to get hungry. And the disciples said, "You better send them away. There's not a McDonald's anywhere near here. This place is deserted. You better send them back to the villages." Well, Jesus said to him, "They need not depart. Give ye them to eat." And they said unto him, "We have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, "Bring them hither to me." And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did eat and were filled, and they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. Okay, it was a miracle, wasn't it? No way to explain this other than the fact this is a miracle. And so with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, we say he fed the 5,000. But look what this says. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men. But that wasn't all that were there. Besides women and children. Listen, they were so intent on hearing Jesus, they went by foot. And not just the men, the mothers went. And they brought their children with them. Now, they didn't say, "Now children, you go to children's church while we go hear the preacher." They didn't say that. They went by foot, bringing their little children out there with them. And that's how bad they wanted to hear it, and didn't even have something to eat. But Jesus took care of them. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into the ship and go before him to the other side, and he sent the multitude away. Jesus needed some time alone. So the disciples crossed the sea in the ship, and he sends the multitudes away. And then we're going to read about how Jesus was walking on the water. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. But when the evening was come, and he was there alone, but the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. Now they saw him from their little boats. They saw Jesus coming, and it scared them. It says, "And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled and say, 'It is a spirit.'" And the word spirit there is not the same word used when it's talking about the Holy Spirit. This is a word you would use when you're talking about a ghost. They said, "This is a ghost. This is a phantom," they thought. And they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake to them and said, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid." And Peter, now listen to Peter here. Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it be thou, bid me come to thee on the water." Well, he did that. He said, "Come." And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Now there's 2 of them out there walking on the water. But Peter, now before you judge Peter, remember, he's the only one that got out of that boat. He was walking on the water, and the others are scared in the boat. They're not done. But Peter walked right on out there. But Peter, he got to looking around at all the trouble, and he started to sink. He took his eyes off Jesus and started worrying about, he realized what is going on, and he couldn't keep himself up. It says, "But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried, saying, 'Lord, save me.' And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and called him and said unto him, 'O thou little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt?'" Now at least Peter knew who to turn to for help, didn't he? "Lord, save me." And Peter caught him and brought him to the ship. Said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. That's like that time he said, "Peace, be still," but this is a different story. But the wind ceased. And they that were in the ship came and worshiped him, saying, "Of a truth, thou art the Son of God." See why Matthew's telling us this? He wants us to know that too. Now, When they were gone over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. Last time Jesus came, it was after a storm. Remember, that was where the demon-possessed man was out there yelling among the tombs, and they sent the demons into the hogs, and the hogs ran down, and the keeper of the hogs went to town and told them, and they came out of the village and told Jesus, "We want you out of here." They must have thought about that. Now Jesus is back, and look how things have changed. It says they came to the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out into all that country round about, and brought unto him all that were diseased, and besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment, and as many as were touched were made perfectly whole. Okay, that was the lesson for tonight. They must have heard the story about the lady that said, "If I could but touch the hem of his garment, I shall be whole." And she did that. Remember? People were talking about these things. And that's what they said. They must have heard that because they used the same words. If we can but touch the hem of his garment, we'll be made whole. Now think about that. Think about their faith. Oh, we have sometimes such little faith, don't we? I mean, the winds look boisterous to us, and we cry out in fear. Well, Jesus will save us, but he wants us to have faith. If we have the faith to touch the hem of his garment, we'll be made whole. There is grace abundant for us. But we've got to reach out to Jesus. And we do that when we hear and believe and obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we obey that when we turn from our sins and confess his name before men, and we're baptized into Christ and come out of that water to live a faithful servant of his all the days of our life. And we can be made whole. Isn't that beautiful? So if you want to respond to that invitation, do it tonight as we stand and sing.